Hello, I'm Michael Collins, and this is Media Focus. In this video, we are going to be looking at essay structure. And I've kept the title deliberately vague because when I say essay structure here, this could be an exam, this could be a set assignment, or this could essentially be any piece of writing that you could possibly want to embark. The subtitle of this is How to Win Over Examiners in Absolutely Any Subject. And this is pretty much my ulterior motive with making this. When you write an essay, when you're in an exam, when you have something which is going to be marked by either your teacher or an external external examiner, you are essentially entering into a dialogue with them. You are saying to them, look, not only do I know my stuff, but also I am an extremely intelligent person and I can construct an argument and I can present my thoughts in an intellectual and sophisticated way. However, sometimes this can be trickier than it actually sounds. And it may well be that you've memorized everything there is to know about A-level media studies. It might well be that you know each and every one of the theories like the back of your hand. And additionally, each and every one of the case studies, and you know the difference in a high angle and a low angle, you know the difference between patriarchal hegemony and societal hegemony and whatnot. But then when it actually comes down to the essay, if you don't know how to structure an essay and if you don't know what to put and where, then you are going to be in a difficult situation when it comes to the exam. Now, I know the same as anybody else in the world that exams are stressful situations. They're tough. They're really, really hard, and they are designed to be hard. They're designed to freak you out. They're designed to stress you out, and they're designed to put you into a situation where essentially that you panic. There's no way of getting around that. And if that sounds cruel, then yeah, it is. And unnecessarily so. And I'm not going to get too much into this right now, but if I could redesign the specifications for the different A-level subjects in the United Kingdom, I would definitely make sure that exams are a very, very small part of what you're assessed on. However, I have not designed the specifications for United Kingdom A-levels, which means I have absolutely no say in this. So unfortunately, a good majority of your marks, 70% of your marks in A-level media, come from the exam. So my goal with this video is to get you into a situation where you are not stressed out about the exam at all. What I want you to be not stressed out, but, thinking about, maybe slightly concerned with, is do you have the subject knowledge? Do you know the case studies? I don't want you to be freaking out about things like timings and stuff like that. I want you to get into the exam. I want you to look at the questions and I want you to think, wow, this is going to be boring. And it will be. If you've done all your preparation, exams should not be stressful. They should be boring. You should not be doing any thinking in an exam at all. That's possibly something slightly controversial to say, but the thing is, you've spent years, 2 years, thinking about A-level media studies. When you get into the exam, the time for thinking is over. You look at the questions in front of you, you already know the answers because that's what you've actually been doing for the last 2 years, and you respond to the questions in a sophisticated way that actually answers the question. So how can you do that? Well, let's go through that now. So first of all, let's get the A-level media studies stuff out of the way with. Let's talk about how many marks there are per section in the new specification EDUCAS A-level media studies exam. So it's split into two different exams, component 1 and component 2. I'm not going to go into what the difference in these two exams are because, quite frankly, you can find loads and loads of information on the blog, on the A-Level Media Studies blog at lr-media.blogspot.com. You can also go ask your teacher about this. You'll have loads and loads of information about this already. But when it comes to marks and timings, component 1A is 45 marks, component 1B is 45 marks. And in component 1, there are many short questions, especially in component 1B, which is shuttered into lots of little questions, some of which may be worth as little as 1 mark. Then we have component 2, which is the second exam you sit and is in loads more detail, and you will have 3 long questions, each of which is 30 marks, so significantly more than almost any question you'll have done so far. In terms of timings, well, I've left that out. We'll come back to that at some other point in the future. But this is roughly how many marks you get for each section. So, in order to talk you through exactly how you answer a question, it would be really, really helpful if we had an example of a question. So this is a past paper question for the EDUCAS A-Level Media Studies exam, and it is as follows. Compared with the past, David Gauntlet argues that in the media today, we no longer get singular, straightforward messages about ideal types of male and female identities. Evaluate the validity of this claim with reference to the set editions of Woman and Adbusters and the historical context in which they were produced. So what we have there is a component 2 section B question. So this is a magazine's question. This one would be 30 marks, which means that in this situation, you would have 50 minutes to respond to this question. So we're talking about quite a significant amount of time to actually answer this question. However, if you looked at this question and if your first thought was, oh crap, then that is a very, very valid response, because this is quite clearly a deliberately tough question, which is asking you to consider a number of different things at once. And actually, a pretty straightforward and valid response to this would be to ramble on about pretty much anything that you can think of, which is to do with maybe David Gauntlet, maybe identity. Go try and cram some Woman and Adbusters in there. Oh, later on you see, there's historical context. I need to talk about the past, I guess. Cool. And what you've done there is you've just waffled for 50 minutes and you haven't actually answered the question. And in order to do that, we actually need to think about what question is being asked here, because this is not something as straightforward as what is 2 plus 2. Which is quite clearly asking for an addition of 2 different numbers with one very clear answer at the end of it. This is a much more vague question, which is hoping for a vast array of different responses to it. And there is no right or wrong answer to this question. So, what do you do first of all? You're sitting in the exam, you just got that question, you're freaking out slightly. What is the very first thing you do? Well, you don't start answering the question straight away. And you don't even start writing a plan yet. No, the first thing that you do straight away is, on the question paper, the thing right in front of you, you underline the key terms. You need to work out which are the words which are actually important, and you need to underline them. And what this will do is it will force you to engage with the concepts that you actually need to deal with in your response. It also means that you are going to be coming back to these keywords time and time again. So let's just look at an example of this. So what are the words I've underlined here? First of all, compared. This means that you're going to have to be doing a comparison. If you don't compare, then you are not going to be answering the question. So compared with the past. Now compared with the past. So you're going to be comparing the present and the past. That's pretty simple. The next thing I've underlined is David Gauntlet, which means that we are going to be talking about theories of identity. Now, David Gauntlet is an interesting theorist because his theory is kind of an audience theory, but it's also kind of a representation theory as well. So this is going to be an audience/representation question. We're going to be talking about both of these things in this question. We also have male and female identities. So we're going to be talking about identity, but we're also going to be talking about the representation of men and women. Cool. Brilliant. We spent a lot of time looking at the representation of men and women. Evaluate. This means we need to work out how true and how useful this statement is. Now, note that I could have underlined evaluate and validity. Well, that's just overkill. Okay? Evaluate. How true is this? Validity is just how true. So I've only just underlined evaluate there. And then we've got historical contexts. So basically, these 2 different magazines are produced in 2 different time periods. So we need to compare the past, which is Woman magazine, which was published, the edition we're looking at was published in 1964, with now. We no longer get now. singular, straightforward messages about ideal types of male and female identities. Well, of course, that's going to be Adbusters. And the edition we're looking at there was published in 2016. So this is a modern magazine. So we're going to need to consider the historical context of Woman, 1964, and the historical context of Adbusters, 2016. So this is kind of fairly straightforward now. What is it actually saying? Well, basically it's saying that women and men were represented very differently in the past to how they are now. Let's just think about that for a sec. That is obvious. That is so obvious. Of course, let's think about the representation of women. Of course, they were represented very, very differently in the past. So that's what you're going to be talking about. And this is why you need to underline your key terms. Step 2 is what I like to call the knee-jerk reaction. So I don't know if you've ever had an injury or something like that and the doctor has tested you to make sure that your body is still functioning. It will lightly hit your knee with a hammer, not in order to hurt you, but just to basically make sure that your nerves, your body, your synaptical responses are still working. And we call this a reflex action. If you whack your knee in a very specific place, then your knee will jerk forward. You have absolutely no response to this. It just happens. When you get in the exam, you are not going to have any time at all to come up with a point of view. You need to come up with a point of view right there and right then. So this is the point where you need to commit. You need to look at the question and think, that is my point of view. Never, ever, ever, ever change your point of view halfway through the exam. That is a bad idea. If you do change your point of view halfway through the exam, you look confused. We'll come back to one point where this is actually acceptable, but everywhere else in your exam, you're going to be presenting one argument. I don't care what you've heard from other lessons in A-level media studies. I want you to present one argument. This is your knee-jerk reaction. Why? Well, we'll come on to that in a second. So what is your honest response to this question? Well, I'll give you an example of an honest, straightforward response to this question. Adbusters presents complex representations of gender, particularly of women, while Woman magazine presents singular and stereotypical and sexist representations of women, which are very much typical of the mid-1960s. There we go. That is not an argument which is going to set the world on fire. That is not some crazy argument which is going to completely change, people's perception of the world. In fact, I would actually say that in many ways this argument is common sense. Yeah, we've seen quite complicated representations of gender in Adbusters, and in Woman magazine, we quite often commented how sexist the magazine is. So, yeah, this is my knee-jerk reaction. And to be quite honest, this is the kind of reaction that you could have to pretty much any question on Adbusters and Woman magazine. And generally, when you're being asked to compare two different things in A-level media studies, this will be because they're the two very different things. So, for example, for the newspaper industry, if you're asked to compare the Times to the Daily Mirror, well, one's a tabloid and one's a broadsheet. So completely different audiences. One is right-wing and one is left-wing. So completely different political perspectives. So we need to consider that you are being asked to compare two things which are very, very different. And that is very, very much the case with this question. So all of this so far has, if you've done this correctly, taken about 30 seconds. Because you've just done the underlining, and as you're underlining, you thought, yeah, that's what I'm going to argue. So maybe 30 seconds maximum. But at this stage, you're going to need to make a plan, which is going to take slightly longer. So what is the point in making a plan? You have so little time in the exam. So why are you going to bother making a plan? Well, there's one very specific reason for making a plan, and this is it will get you marks. If you scribble out some key terms, some ideas, names of theorists, I don't know, then the examiner is going to see this and they're going to give you marks for it because it demonstrates knowledge and understanding. So for this reason, make sure that your plan is on your question paper. Do not put it on, no, make sure it's on your answer paper. Sorry, like where you write your answer. If you're scared about, the examiner not being able to tell it's a plan, just put it in a box or something like that and write plan underneath it. That's fine. But the examiner will quickly glance through your plan. And if they see a word like patriarchal hegemony, they're already thinking this student knows their key terminology. Already they're starting to suss you out and they're starting to think about what mark they're going to give you. So a plan is absolutely essential. I also like to think about a plan as a shopping list. Imagine going shopping in a supermarket when you have no idea what you're getting. You will come back with very, very little stuff which is of any use at all, and you'll need to go out shopping again. So if you have a shopping list, on the other hand, it means that you don't forget things. So right there, at the start of the exam, I'm sorry, this is not a very, very nice turn of phrase. I want you to vomit your ideas onto the page. Any idea that you have which might be related to this subject, I want you to just chuck it all onto the page. So thinking about the question that we're looking at the moment, David Gauntlet, we no longer get straightforward ideas about male and female identity. To what extent can we evaluate the validity of this claim? Woman adbusters. Well, here's all the stuff that jumped into my head. Representation, sexism, objectification, David Gauntlet. Well, he's kind of a given, but I put him down anyway because I want to talk about him quite clearly. Pick and mix theory, which is associated with David Gauntlet. Stereotypes, patriarchal hegemony, hegemonic norms and values. Then we don't just need to talk about David Gauntlet. So actually Van Zoonen's male gaze theory, that'll be really, really useful. The idea of gender performativity, so that is Judith Butler, and also socio-historical context. This is my plan. It's not a particularly in-depth or crazy plan. It doesn't tell you exactly what to put in each paragraph, but as I go through this, I can tick it off as I identify points in each paragraph. I might decide, okay, cool, I'm going to write a paragraph on how women are objectified in Woman magazine and how women are not objectified in Adbusters. And I am going to compare the mise en scène of these two different magazines. And that is going to be my paragraph. Wonderful, let's get stuck in. Except you've forgotten the most important paragraph of all. And this is the introduction. Now, again, this is one of these situations where different teachers will have different opinions on which is the most important bit. For me, the introduction is the most important paragraph of all. Now, let's be honest here. If we've got an examiner who is marking 200 papers, let's just say he or she, after a while, is going to get pretty bored of doing that. And let's just say if they have marked 150 papers and they're a bit sleepy and they need to mark a few more before they can justify going to bed that night, then they might be cutting corners at some stage. I shouldn't say this at all. Obviously, examiners will spend exactly the same amount of time on every paper. We know that, blah, blah, blah. But just in case, you need to make sure that your introduction, which is the first thing that they're going to read, is absolutely spot on. And not only that, your introduction should actually sum up your entire essay. So, this is not really something I thought about when I was in high school. It's not something I thought about in sixth form. I wasn't actually introduced to this idea until I was doing my degree. So you can structure an introduction like this. You can split it into 3 sections: definition, argument, and context. Now, you can also do this in any order you like. You might want to start off with your argument and then move on to definition and context. You might want to do context, argument, definition. These can be in any order. And the only reason really why I like definition, argument, and context is because it spells out the word DAC, and DAC sounds funny. However, if you like CAD or CDA, please be my guest. So what do these actually mean? Well, first of all, you need to define. You need to define the key word of your question. And you also need to make a brief explanation as to why this is important to talk about. So, yeah, we'll come on to a couple of examples of that in a second. After you define your key word, you then move on to your argument or your point of view. And then finally, you'll talk about the context of your chosen texts. So this is your background information, the genre, what year it was released, how many copies did it sell, who is the director or the producer, what company made it. It really, really depends on what you're talking about. But this is where you get your background knowledge in. So already you've shown your knowledge of media, you've shown your ability to create an argument, and also you've shown your historical knowledge as well, your knowledge and understanding. And this is all through the introduction. So here's just a couple of examples of what I mean by representation, by definitions. So let's just say we got a question on representation. I don't know, compare and contrast the representation of women in, the newspapers you've studied. I don't know, something like that. So first of all, we actually need to define what representation is. Why? Well, you're not telling the examiner something they don't know already. The examiner is going to know what representation is, but they don't know that you know what representation is. So by defining it, you are demonstrating the fact that you know the definition of the word representation. You are also making it clear to yourself that you know the definition for the word representation, which will then allow you to make a much stronger argument. Like sometimes I just like to remind myself, I actually do know what I'm talking about. So these would be the very, very first sentences of your essay on a question on representation. Representation refers to the construction of reality. Representations are constructed by the producers of media products in order to reinforce agendas, ideals, and ideologies of institutions. There we go. So you've just demonstrated you know exactly what representation is, but you've also pointed out why it is important as well. Let's try this now for audience. So if we get a question on audience, and spoilers, you will get a question on audience. Contrary to previous thoughts on audiences, both theorists and producers now agree that audiences are complex and have a variety of different needs, tastes, and ways of using media products. So this one is less trying to define what audience is, because actually that's kind of boring. The audience, the people that use or consume a media product. Okay, we can actually assume at that stage that the examiner will know what audience is. But I've just jumped straight into it. I've just talked about why audience is important. This idea that audiences are not passive. They don't just absorb what they see, but instead they have needs, they have tastes, they have ways of using media products. So that's really, really important. Then we come on to the A of DAC, which is your argument. So let's just say we're making an argument to do with genre. We got a question on genre. Well, what is our argument going to be? Potentially, genre is primarily used as a shortcut by producers in order to target audiences in the most efficient manner possible. However, many media products can subvert audience expectations while at the same time conforming to genre conventions, which is basically saying that sometimes things will play by the rules or go against the rules. So that's exactly what we've done in class. Like, that's genre 101. Here's an argument about distribution. And this is a question which might, for example, come up for the video game industry. Although here I've put it for newspapers. Distribution is undoubtedly important for the newspaper industry, missed off a word there. However, I will argue that other factors such as star appeal and modern digital technologies are more important for both financial and critical success in the newspaper industry. So what I've done there is, let's just say the question is on how important is distribution for the newspaper industry. I have just subverted that. I have just basically said, well, actually, it's not the most important thing. I'm going to be arguing something a little bit different. I'm going to be arguing that actually technology and star appeal are both more important. And you can totally do that. If you get a to what extent question, don't be afraid of saying to not much extent at all. I'm going to argue some other things. So let's take a look at an example of an introduction now. In what ways can newspapers incorporate viewpoints and ideologies for their audiences? Definition. The producers of newspapers typically incorporate a range of ideological perspectives when creating newspapers. This is for several reasons, including commercial, ideological, and audience-related. Ideology itself refers to the beliefs and viewpoints of the producer. Through media language, audiences are invited to explore and negotiate a range of responsibilities. So that's just defining audience there. Argument. However, typically producers will attempt to anchor these responses through techniques such as captions in order to explore how newspapers incorporate viewpoints and ideologies. See, my argument was actually very short there because my definition was actually quite long. Context. I shall be exploring the examples of the Daily Mirror, a British tabloid newspaper catering to a working-class left-wing audience, and The Times, a broadsheet targeting a middle-class right-wing audience. I shall also be supplementing these examples with material from the Mail Online, a particularly popular online branch of the right-wing Daily Mail that primarily targets a working-class female audience. And there we have it. There we have quite a straightforward introduction which uses DAC, or definition, argument, and context. Next, let's take a look at the actual paragraphs that you're going to be writing in your essay. So this is basically the meat of your response. Now, in your introduction, you pointed out what it is that you're going to be arguing, but in your paragraphs, this is where you demonstrate through using precise examples why you are right. Now, I don't think there's any reason to reinvent the wheel with paragraph structure, and I know for a fact that in secondary school you used a variety of different ways to structure paragraphs. So you might have used Pete, peel, or whatever. Personally, I like P, and I like P to be spelled P-E-A. And this stands for point, evidence, argument. We can also add on theory onto the end there to make Pete, but I've got to admit, I like to keep things as simple as possible. And I think basically you don't always need to include a theory in every paragraph. It can really, really help. And if you do, you should probably put it at the end. So in general, point, evidence, argument. So what does this actually mean? So the point is the actual point that you're making in a paragraph. So this is the thing which your paragraph is going to be about. And this is probably going to be a sentence long. Afterwards, straight away, and this might well be the longest part of the paragraph, although this can differ depending on your paragraph structure, this is your evidence. And this is where you take an actual example that you've learnt about in class, and you use this example to back up your point. And rather than just waffling or saying this and that, this is your opportunity to use media language. This is your opportunity to use shot types, camera angles, mise en scène, lexis, language, whatever, editing. You can chuck it all into the evidence section of your paragraph. The more, the merrier. Okay? And I really, really do mean that. The more you chuck in there, the more knowledge and understanding you demonstrate, and also the more you back up your point. How many examples should you include in each paragraph? 1. Any more would just be confusing. At this stage as well, you've also got to consider, do you use one example from both the texts you're comparing, or do you split onto different paragraphs? Well, I can't actually answer that question for you. Personally, maybe this is because my brain is very, very small. I can't really talk about more than one bit of evidence in one paragraph. I would much, much, much rather write much shorter paragraphs. So, for example, if we're comparing Adbusters and Woman, I'd rather write a short paragraph about Adbusters and then write a short paragraph about Woman. Okay, and that's where my comparison is going to be. But if you want to watch them into one larger paragraph, then please be my guest. And then afterwards, in the final piece of your paragraph, is the argument section. And this is where you back up your argument based on the argument that you presented in the introduction of your essay. You don't just go off on one here. This is where you present your argument. This is where you respond. This is where you reinforce the argument that you've been making since the beginning. So when it comes to your paragraph structure, you need to make sure that each and every point that you make links to the question which is being asked of you in the question that you're answering. If you don't, then you are going to waffle. So you need to make sure that your point links back to the question. And probably the easiest way to do this is to rephrase the question. And you can be quite blunt about this. You can say, another way which confirms the ways in which women and men are represented. No, it doesn't sound very good. Another way in which the representations of women have evolved and changed significantly over a period of time is... or something along those lines. Okay, that doesn't sound quite so elegant, but I'm just trying to make stuff up on the fly. So you just need to make sure that every single last point you make links back to the question which is being asked. So let's come up with an example of a point now. So we're going to change our question. No, for no real reason other than, let's just mix and match things a little bit. So our question is now slightly more straightforward. In what ways can newspapers incorporate viewpoints and ideologies for their audiences? Our point is going to be the front cover of the Times, on the other hand, demonstrates an initially oppositional ideological viewpoint. So for this one, we're saying that it's presenting a completely different ideological viewpoint to the Daily Mirror, which presumably we've looked at in another paragraph. Then we need to back this up with evidence. And as we can see, this is long, this is big. I would also like to point out at this stage that this paragraph was written for the previous specification, which uses slightly different, well, very different front covers for the Daily Mirror and the Times, but you'll get the gist of things. So, evidence. A mid-shot double-page splash wraparound cover, saved only for the very most notable events, adorns this edition. Trump gestures passively with his fist, eyes to the right of the camera. In the front of the background, an American flag. The flag has clear connotations for the right-wing target audience of patriotism and of freedom and of victory. The headline, The New World, is presented in a serif font, offering a sophisticated mode of address to the target middle-class audience. However, the Times does not openly ideologically support Trump in the same way that the Mirror opposes him. In an example of bias through selection, an image of Trump looking either smug or lost, depending on the negotiation that the audience is selected. His fist has symbolic connotations of power, but also functions as a proeretic code suggesting violence ahead. This is further anchored to the sophisticated target audience through the lexis of a subheading, demonstrating that Trump will send shockwaves around the globe. So as we can see through this evidence, we've actually started to go on to the argument a little bit. We've started to talk about the different way in which ideology has been incorporated for the audience. So this is one of the ways in which PEA doesn't always work out perfectly. So let's then come on to the analysis, the argument rather, A for argument. The negative connotations of shockwave make intertextual reference to the disaster genre once more. However, the dominant reading is hard for the audience to deduce. The Times neither endorses nor rejects Trump's ideology. Even the pull quote on the back cover, with its repeated use of "you will be so proud," can be polysemically interpreted by the target audience. So, what we have there is the evidence has really just gone through the E and the A there. We've just continually gone back to the evidence. And this is a really, really sophisticated way of demonstrating your argument. And this is also another excellent example of a paragraph which doesn't actually involve a theory. I could have tried to cram a theory in here, but actually this paragraph, as we can see here, I didn't include the whole paragraph, but the paragraph is actually already fairly long. And we probably want to jump back to a completely different point. Now, there are plenty of theories that we can use if we are talking about viewpoints and ideologies for audience. For example, David Gauntlet, theories of identity. We might also want to talk about Stuart Hall and reception theory, which we've kind of hinted at there. But actually, this paragraph is kind of good without theory at this stage. And you'll notice if you ever look at the mark scheme, it doesn't actually say you must use theory. It says students may use theory. It in the A section. Personally, I think at some point you are going to have to use theory, but for this paragraph, we don't really need to. This, of course, leads us on to the final part of your essay, which is the conclusion. After you've written a bunch of paragraphs, how many? Well, it really depends on how long your answer is. Maybe 4, maybe 6 paragraphs for a particularly long one, but it might be 2 or 3 on a much shorter answer. You have your conclusion. Now, let's just be really, really frank about the conclusion. The conclusion should include no new information. Don't do that. The conclusion only sums up what you have presented in your argument so far. So don't present any new arguments in the conclusion. That's what the main essay body is for. And the conclusion is only there to restate the very same argument that you have been making throughout the essay. So you do not switch your mind at the last second. In short, the conclusion is actually the least important paragraph of your entire essay. It's still important. And if you run out of time, well, of course, that's going to impact your mark, but not actually nearly as much as you think. Because if you've got a really, really good introduction and if all your paragraphs are spot on, let's just say you run out of time and only write a sentence to the conclusion, well, you've pretty much done everything. You might lose 1 or 2 marks, but actually you've pretty much got everything, so who cares? Move on to the next question. Your time is up. The conclusion just basically sums up everything and just basically says, this is my argument and this is why I am right. So, advanced technique, the however paragraph. Now, you might be thinking at this stage, well, maybe actually there's more than one right answer. Maybe actually, we could argue that in many ways, the representation of women in Woman magazine is actually quite progressive. And this is something that we looked at in class quite a lot. We actually looked at, well, in one image in Woman magazine, we see a woman talking to her son and apparently teaching him how to cook, which is quite gentle and is quite subtle, but maybe actually that's the subversion of patriarchal gender stereotyping. We have a woman, a mother, teaching her son to do something. So quite clearly that goes against the sexist, straightforward, stereotypical representations of women. So while you should present a clear and consistent argument throughout your essay, it might well be that actually you want to present an alternative or a contradictory point of view. Now, my advice is you only do this in your final paragraph before your conclusion. And I like to call this the however paragraph. So let's just say we've been talking about how woman is extremely sexist and how Adbusters is very progressive. However, we do see some examples in Woman magazine of progressive representations of women which go against sexist stereotypes which would have been evidenced in the 1960s. For example, through the mise-en-scène of the close-up shot of the woman teaching her son how to cook, we see an inversion of patriarchal hegemonic stereotypes which indicate that men and boys only fulfill certain roles in society. Then we'll go into a little bit more detail. Maybe, this is an excellent example of a subversion of Judith Butler's notion of gender performativity, blah, blah, blah. However, then we go into our conclusion and we would say, however, ultimately, as we have seen throughout this essay, Woman magazine has presented a singular, sexist and straightforward representation of women. And then in the final paragraph, the conclusion, you just basically sum everything up. You just give a quick example of everything it is you talked about. And then you say, for these reasons, we see the representation of women has completely changed over these years. And the best thing to do is to end your essay with arguing that you were completely right all along. So, yeah, that is essentially everything that you need to know about structuring an essay. There are lots and lots of different ways of structuring essays. If you have any issue with any of this, please do not follow my advice. You can do whatever you want. However, I'm going to be slightly big-headed here and I'm going to say that my method is the best method. The reason for this is it is the most simple and straightforward method. There are only 2 acronyms you need to remember, and they are DAC and P, which are funny, I guess. And once you've memorized them, that is basically it. It also allows you to answer any question, no matter how complicated. And the only thing that you really need to do at this stage is make sure that you've revised everything to the highest possible degree. So as a conclusion to this video, remember that all your learning comes through lessons. It comes through the reading that you do around lessons. It comes through the practice. You are not going to come to some sudden epiphany in the exam. Okay? Do remember that in the exam, you've done all your learning already, and these are the conclusions which you come to. Okay, so you have already made your decisions, and no matter what question comes up in the exam, you can use this technique to answer them and potentially get full marks and completely blow away the examiner.